Hi, I'm Tony Dominguez, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about violent crime and specifically solutions to violent crime, because it is such a huge problem, not just in the United States, but in the world, and there are ways to solve this problem. To give a little bit of a layout of what violent crime is, it's act of violence against from one person to another, typically with a weapon. And different types of this would be aggravated assault, sexual assault, robbery, and these almost always involve some sort of weapon or some sort of premeditation to attack another person. To give a specific example would be New York City, because it's had such an up and down of violent crime rates, and specifically murder. And you could see these trends change based on the types of policies that were in place to combat these violent crimes. And the crime rate peaked in about the 1980s, or it really spiked in that time because of the crack epidemic that was going on. There was a lot of different gangs, mafias, a lot of different violence between these groups that definitely drove up the murder rate. As I said, it started to spike in the 80s, but it really peaked in the 90s. That was at the height of it, because in the 1960, the murder rate was about 4.7. This statistic, this murder rate would be 4.7 out of 100,000 of the population. So this could be spread across the entire nation based per capita. And so it rose from 4.7 to 31 in 1991. That was the peak. And so that 4.7 per 100,000 rising to 31 per 100,000 is a huge difference. And that crack epidemic of this drug war that was going on, it made the problem really bad. But it declined very steeply, the crime rate, because of this expansion of the police force. Now, why did it drop? Like I said, the expansion of the police force. Mayors implemented a stronger task force to fight these drug wars, and it drastically drove down the crime rates. It would employ large police forces to combat these violent crimes, and this is when stop and frisk or Terry stops were introduced to combat these violent crimes by they would give officers much greater power in investigative abilities. So what is a Terry stop? It's a Supreme Court case that came in 1963. It was Terry versus Oklahoma, and the story of it goes, Officer McFadden in Cleveland, Ohio, he was patrolling the city of Cleveland, and he noticed three suspicious men. They were outside a jewelry store, just kind of hanging out, talking to each other, pacing back and forth, looking in. And he saw that it looked really suspicious. So Officer McFadden approached them, asking for their name, what they were doing, and he wouldn't get adequate answers from them. So what he did is he took it upon himself to act off of reasonable suspicion by putting them up against the wall, patting them down to see if they were carrying anything. And what he found on these three men were two concealed weapons that were illegal firearms. And so by implementing this ability that he practiced as a police officer, he was able to stop this crime. They were going to rob the jewelry store. And so John Terry and Richard Chilton were the two men that had these illegal firearms on them. They were charged with the possession of it, but when this case came to court, the defense attorneys tried to dismiss the evidence because it was illegally obtained by Officer McFadden. They said he did not have the right to search them just off of suspicion. And there is reasonable suspicion, but he didn't think that he had enough reasonable suspicion as they were just walking down the street looking into stores. The court ruled in favor of Officer McFadden by saying he did have reasonable suspicion by noticing them talking to each other, peering into the jewelry store. It looked like they were hatching a plan, and so the court did take Officer McFadden's side. The important thing about this is that the Bill of Rights in our country is very important, and the Fourth Amendment specifically about illegal search and seizure was not violated by this Terry stop. And that is important to highlight because it means that police officers can implement these laws without breaking the Constitution, and it's very controversial. Terry stops should be implemented to stop violent crime. To see this in practice, it's not like it hasn't been done before. So since that case started in 1963, it has been practiced in a few high populous cities. Former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg, he was actually a former presidential candidate of the 2020 election, he practiced these Terry stop policies. implemented stop and frisk laws and policies for these police officers to use. In 2013, Michael Bloomberg was the New York City mayor, and he had a murder rate of 3.3. This is 3.3 murders per 100,000 people. While the national average was the national average in 2013 was 4.5, so a little bit higher than New York. And it might seem a little bit of a difference, but you think about how densely populated New York City is and how much violence there was in history, and that it was below the national average is very impressive than a lot of other rural places and suburban areas that would have higher crimes than this super urbanized New York City. And yeah, it just was very impressive, and it was one of Mike Bloomberg's biggest accomplishments as mayor to drastically bring down that violent crime rate. The results of this were fewer violent crimes, particularly with deadly weapons. It would discourage people from carrying these guns because they wouldn't know if they would be stopped and searched, if they looked suspicious or not. I mean, cops are trained to pick up on nonverbal cues to see if somebody's acting suspicious, and if they feel that, they can search them, and if they find an illegally obtained weapon, they can be charged. And so this would discourage the carrying of these illegal firearms, driving down the number of firearms on the street that were just being carried around by anybody. The controversy around this is admittedly very viable. Unfortunately, there are many cases of racial profiling for minority groups, police officers against minority groups, and it is a heavily highlighted topic in the news today, and it's something that it is very unfortunate. But when you look at the takeaways, public policy is about risk and reward, and you got to balance those two. And even though it causes tension between the police and public, there is a public relation that is very important. Even though it causes that tension, the risk is certainly worth the reward. It may have some bad stories, but you see these drastic drops in violent crime that it should be better. It should be implemented. So I would encourage you to support, and not just support, but also defend these stop and frisk laws. It may be controversial, it may be non-popular to support these laws, but it is important to ensure that police officers have the right to use their investigative abilities to stop violent crime. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation about stop and frisk policy and how important it can be in combating violent crimes.